Since I don't have any brakes to bend my aluminum, and the brakes that I have access to that I don't own, they are very big and very bulky, and they're just not well suited for small thin pieces of aluminum. So here is my solution. This is my wood work table. It's 3/4 inch plywood, and then on top of that I have this thin 1/8 inch piece of plywood. It was actually packing material for some of the aluminum that I had purchased. I just have it laid up here just so I can do my various cutting on the poster board. I could use my utility knife and cut my poster board right on this without damaging my wood table underneath. So what I have done is I use pieces of hardwood, various lengths and various heights, and I will line up my bend line on the aluminum with the edge of the table, and then I use my hardwood pieces of scrap and I line them up on the bend line as well, and then I clamp it in place, and then I can just bend these down till they line up with, or till they lay flat against the edge of the work table. Now I had been using these smaller 2-inch clamps for most of my work, but they don't have obviously the holding power that these big ones do, and because the throat depth is so small, you don't have a lot of room to work with, which I'll explain here in a minute. With the bigger clamps, since you have this big throat, you can move the clamp. Rather than having it clamped way back here, I can actually clamp directly over where I want to make the bends, and I can make the bend without the C-clamp body getting in the way. On the smaller clamps, if I clamped it here, the clamp body would come around and come down really close to where I need to make the bend, and I couldn't get in here to make the bend. I couldn't get tooling in here to make the bend because the body of the clamp was in the way. So I use these bigger clamps so I can clamp where I need the clamping force, and then the body of the clamp itself is well enough out of the way that I can still work. And then again, you do want to clamp over top of where you're going to make the bends. If you have really long pieces, you can use multiple clamps, and if you have to, you can take the clamp body and move it and make your bends, and move it, make your bends. That has not really been an issue from what I have found, but it may depending on what you're bending. So now with this clamped in place, as I said, everything is lined up. My bend lines are lined up with the edge of the table, and then this piece of hardwood is lined up with the bend line as well. So this surface right through here is all flat and smooth. This is all on the same plane. This is all on the same plane. And then I can make these bends. And all I do is, since it's so thin initially, I just bend these down by hand like this. And of course that's not going to give me a very sharp corner, and it's also not going to give me a, this is not going to lay flat. And then I come back with my ball peen hammer, and very gently I will work these down. This is getting blurry. You go right along the bend to bend that nice and tight and flat, and just kind of keep working it until it's flat and true. And that's it. That's my bend. And I'll pull this off and show you what it looks like here in a moment, and I'll come back when I start getting into more of the compound type of bends where I have things already bent and I'm trying to bend other things. How do you get in there to do all that? So I'll cover that here in a moment. Alright, so there's the bend that I just made. I just unclamped it and brought it over, and you can see it's actually quite nice. It's easy to work with this thin aluminum. So bending it around a table corner, a table edge is kind of nice. I like using the plywood edge of my bench as a bending mechanism, just because it is wood and it's a little soft, and you don't get any kind of tooling marks on the inside of the bend. You don't get any hard tooling marks in here, or any kind of creases or any kind of gouging that you might get with some of the steel brakes, because this aluminum is soft. The wood is nice because it doesn't mar the aluminum material at all, and it gives you a nice little, a little bit of a softer bend radius. Although with this thin a material, I don't know how critical that is, but I feel better having the softer radius on the bends, which the wood tends to do. And you can see where I had relieved the corners by pre-drilling. You can see that here as well. This is what I talked about before. When you punch your hole locations through your template, also punch your locations for your relieved corners, so that when you make the bend, you don't have that sharp corner where the bends interface with the rest of the aluminum. Alright, I'm going to continue to bend this piece, and when I get into some of the more complicated type bends, I'll do some videotaping and try to explain how I do that. Now I'm getting ready to make another bend. However, this one is a little bit more complicated for a couple of reasons. One, I'm going to bend this leg right here, but I am not going to bend this leg. So this leg's going to be the only thing bent, and it's got to stop short here. It's not going to continue all the way across. Second of all, I have to bend this leg up. All of these bends are bent in the same direction. However, I can't put the piece this way to make this bend down across the end of my bench, because I have these bends already in place, and the only way I could do that would be to put some kind of block under here to hold the whole thing in the air, and then make this bend down like these. So what I elected to do is take these bend lines and transfer them to the back side of the template, which you can see here, and I've got my bend indicator here, and I've got another couple here. So I'll do basically the same thing. I'll just line up my bend lines, this bend line here with the edge of the table, and this bend line here with the edge of the table. And I've custom cut a piece of my hardwood to fit in here like that, and I'll clamp this down, and then once I have everything in alignment and clamped, I'll bend just this run here up. So now this piece of hardwood basically in effect becomes the edge of my table. So I'll make this bend, and then I'll reposition everything, and I'll make this bend here, and I'll do those the same way. I'll have it oriented like this. I'll line it up on the edge of my table. I'll put my wood in place, and then I'll bend it this way. I'll bend it up this way, and then I've got this edge here. I've got my reference line here, and I've got a reference mark here. Same thing. I'll line up the marks, put my piece of wood that's cut to length, clamp it, and bend this up. So let me do those few bends, and then I'll come back. Here's the piece of wood I believe I use for this one, like that. Alright, let me do those. Here I'm demonstrating the use of various pieces of wood to make the bend that you need. Again, I have the aluminum template upside down, if you will, and I'm making the bend rather than down across the table, the edge of the table. I'm making it up across this piece of hardwood. But because I had made this bend here first, I didn't have room for my normal piece of hardwood to be laid in place to make this bend. This piece of wood was too fat to lay in here because of this bend. So I had to go with this thinner piece of wood here. As I said, this piece would not fit here and line up on the layout line to make this bend, because I had made this bend here first and now the wood won't fit. So I had to go to a thinner piece of wood, but the work is still the same. Using a thinner piece of wood with the lines, the reference lines lined up, the piece of wood lined up, C-clamps clamped, and you just make the bend. Alright. So here's the piece so far with the majority of the bends complete. I have one more bend to make. Again, you can see the relief holes for the corner bends, and you can see a couple more of them here as well. The nice bend radius that you get from using the wood, it kind of gives it it's a fairly sharp bend, but it's nice and soft because the wood itself is somewhat flexible. So that is where I am so far. Like I said, I have one more bend. I have to make this bend here, which is going to be a little bit tricky, but I'll explain how to do it here in a moment. One thing that you'll notice is I have these are actually 1/4 inch bends along the length of a lot of these pieces, such as across the back here. And then I've got another 1/4 inch bend across this length here. And then I've got another one here. And all that is for mostly is, if I just bent the tabs here for mounting on both sides, and I did not put this bend in here, this bend, or this bend, this piece across this length here would be like a wet noodle. There'd be no strength at all. So making these bends across the lengths, it almost acts as a rib support, and it stiffens this up here so that this length of thin aluminum is pretty strong. Even here, if this bend was not across here, this shelf here that sticks out past this would just be flopping around all over the place. But with this, it makes it very strong. So that's why I incorporated these bends, just to stiffen the piece up. So now I'm going to do this bend here, and it's a bend, I'm trying to look at the one that I have done. It's greater than 90 degrees. It's a bend that you have to bend it beyond 90. So what I'll do is I'll bend it 90 degrees, and then I'll have to finish up the rest of the bend by hand, and I'll do that next. So this is probably the most tricky bend to do on these engine cooling inlet templates. If you'll note that this across here is where the bend needs to take place, and you'll note that this leg here is longer than this leg here, and you'll note that I have these 90-degree bends on these edges already in place. So when this whole assembly gets bent this way, these 90-degree bends here are going to end up protruding inward toward my wood, and with this leg being long, had I C-clamped right onto my wood like I did with this one, this leg would end up hitting the C-clamp. So I had to add another extra block here to get the C-clamp up out of the way, and I have the block stepped back here so that this 90-degree bend, when this whole piece gets bent up, this will have room and it won't interfere with this piece of wood across here, because this piece of wood is stepped back away from the edge where the bend is actually going to take place. So I hope that makes sense. I'm basically just making room so when this piece of aluminum comes up, none of these pre-bent edges will interfere with the wood or the C-clamp. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to bend this 90 degrees and then I'll have to take it beyond 90 by hand. Here's the finished piece. Considering that this was all done on the edge of a workbench using wood blocks and a ball-peen hammer and some hand bending, literally by hand, I think it came out quite well. It's a relatively, it's not a complicated piece by any means, but there are a lot of bends and they're in two different planes. So it takes a little bit of thought, but again, just trace out the template as drawn for the most part, and using the various pieces of hardwood cut to the appropriate size that you need, and you can get this piece made relatively easily. It took me about 45 minutes or so to make this, to bend this piece up, but that was with these included videotapes. If I were just to bend it outright without pausing to take pictures and to take a video, I can get this thing made and I can get it bent in probably 15-20 minutes. So it's really not that big of a deal. But there it is. And once I get this in place with the rest of the air inlets, the rest of the air inlet pieces, I'll get some photographs and do some more videotaping of the finished product.